Okay, hi everybody. So we're back with another AMA with Hut 8 Mining, and today we have Tanya Woods, our head of regulatory in-house counsel. Tanya, you do so many things here. What else? What else do you do here?
So I'm the general counsel, the corporate secretary, and I oversee regulatory affairs for the company. And just generally trying to make sure that I know what's up with our business to serve our shareholders well.
Awesome. Okay, so we're really excited to have you here today. Um, and we polled the audience. We got quite a few questions, but we're going to keep it relatively short and sweet today. Um, but you know what? Let's start off by tell us a little bit about your background and experience advancing legislation and blockchain policy in Canada, because I think that's
Yeah,
something our audience really needs to know.
yeah, sure. By training, I'm a lawyer, obviously. It's why I'm general counsel. But I've spent quite a number of years. I was actually looking, I think I've been called to the bar almost 15 years now. But working really, really tediously at technology law issues and P2P. And so I've had a long career that's been exclusively in advanced technologies and P2P. I was a trade negotiator for Canada and a bunch of different trade agreements, trying to advance our global interest as a country. And also, I've worked with multinationals, very, very large companies and some smaller ones around the world at the edge of innovation. So I've had a lot of experience from a variety of different perspectives inside big tech. But certainly in this space, I was really excited to see how it evolved, even as early as 2010 and 2011. And I got very much more engaged with legislation and policy back in 2016. In 2016, I had been a very successful lobbyist. I had brought Canada's digital skills strategy to existence with a number of friends and stakeholders in the industry. It was a multi-billion-dollar commitment from government. It's still ongoing. It's lasted, I think, almost a decade now. But it's nothing short of remarkable. A little short than a decade, a little shorter than a decade, but it took about that long to get there. But we've been able to really draw attention to the fact that Canadians are incredibly bright, very innovative, and have a lot of skills to offer big companies and small companies in the country. And that's no exception with the case of blockchain. And so in 2017, I was reached out to by a friend who was also one of the kind of early founders of the industry. And he said, "Hey, Tanya, look, like we need a hand. There's this blockchain digital asset thing going on, and it's rapidly evolving. Can you give us a hand?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. What do you need?" And he said, "We need government to hear us." And I said, "All right." And so these were some of the founders of Ethereum, some of the very first touch points in Canada in the space. And they had no idea really how to get government to listen. And so I joined them with the blockchain trade association that they had been working at. And it was mostly volunteer run. It had really yet to be formalized. And then they agreed. There was 100 members at the time, and I think everybody agreed that we needed a trade association. So we started Canada's first Chamber of Digital Commerce back in 2019. And there we launched Canada's first national election strategy for blockchain. We wrote the first ecosystem report to help government understand, what do the careers look like in this space? What kind of contributions do they actually make to GDP? What is important to the ecosystem? Its diversity, the sectors it impacts. We did a ton of quite foundational groundwork. And then, of course, I joined Hut 8. So I've had a
Very
fair amount of
cool.
experience, but that's where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very cool. And I think the fact that you're so comfortable and understand how to build sort of that grassroots from the ground up awareness and campaigning, I think is so incredible. So on that note, then, in your opinion, why is building relationships with policymakers in Canada so important, and obviously, especially with respect to blockchain in particular?
Yeah, I mean, look, you'll never get really great law and policy and support as an industry subset or ecosystem if government doesn't understand what you do and you fundamentally rely on government to give you clear guideposts about what you can do. I mean, this is a space that's got a lot of regulatory discussion swirling around it, and yet it's still the case in most parts of the world that securities regulators don't actually understand what they're meant to be covering. I mean, they know they're covering securities, but to identify which tokens are actually securities, there's still a lot of gray, there's still a lot of question marks, and that's only one small facet. And when you look at the way blockchain innovation pervades kind of every sector, every area, you can find almost in any government department whether it's small or large, federal, regional, municipal, whatever it be, state, if you're in the U.S., someone in that department will care. And it's simply because how broad blockchain technology actually is. So in our case, it's very important. I think it's very important generally for blockchain innovators and companies that represent the space and digital asset space that they actually have a dialogue with their government, because government's not going to understand your business the way you understand your business, and government doesn't understand our business the way we understand our business. But it is our job to say, hey, we're here to help you, and we want you to understand this, because when you're deciding how to regulate us, if you should regulate us and what that's going to look like, you really do need to understand how it all fits together. And I think we saw a most recent example of this, and where the gaps were with the U.S. infrastructure bill. So I think that's one of the main reasons is we want regulation. We like guideposts. It gives business certainty, but at the same time, we don't need too much of it, and we don't need bad regulation or unclear regulation. So you have to talk to government to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. To your point, we don't need unthoughtful and prohibitive to innovation regulation. So on that note, the recent proposed infrastructure bill out of the US, the one that suggests raising 28 billion in crypto taxes. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And
Sure.
Maybe, how even if miners in Canada who don't have operations in the US, how we could potentially be affected, or if we're okay for now, like what's sort of the lay of the land on that side? Oh, play.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure bill is a great example. I mean, in truth, the U.S. Senate passed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill under the Investment and Jobs Act. And it was historical given the fact that it was so large and so meaningful generally. But for our community, it was notable because it included crypto, and nobody really expected it. Everybody, had been working for years. There are several trade associations in Washington for years trying to get the government to understand. There was quite a lot of engagement, but it still took them by surprise. Oh, come on. Yeah, the U.S. infrastructure bill was a great example of where the industry had actually been quite engaged. And because of what had been going on, somehow there ended up being this massive addition to the bill that the cryptocurrency and digital asset blockchain communities didn't see coming. And what resulted from it was, thankfully, there were a number of trade associations, ready. They took up the task. They worked incredibly intensely to ensure that the bill itself didn't have a damaging impact on stakeholders that it shouldn't have addressed. So in short, for our industry, the bill includes language that creates responsibilities regarding KYC and AML to the IRS. And tax would have actual tangible tax implications for anybody who would meet or be caught under the definition of broker. And the definition of broker in the bill is incredibly broad. So it's any person who, for consideration, so generally money or some kind of other benefit, is responsible for regularly providing any service effectuating transfers of digital assets on behalf of another person. And when you take our perspective as a miner, the big alarm bells for us was, well, wait a minute. I mean, the whole function of miners is to help verify and validate these transactions. We're a service that's essential. We're infrastructure. We're in the backbone of all of this. Does this mean we now have these obligations, and could we even meet them even if we did have them? And, it just wasn't a realistic application. And so what we ended up seeing in the US in response, of course, was thankfully some attempt at clarification in the Senate. And they did what was called they had a colloquy. So it's on the record, clarification made, their statements, verbal statements made, because they just couldn't achieve clarity in the language itself. They had worked, I think there was one senator, if I remember correctly, who was just holding out the vote, but they were almost entirely, the Senate was clear and wanted to make clear that miners were not intended to be caught. It would be like saying the internet should be taxed. I mean, that's effectively the equivalent. And so they made these statements, but that didn't actually end up changing the language. And so at least the statements are on record. We're happy about that. But it just gives you a live example of the problem when you don't take the time and the steps to be educated enough when you're writing these things as government, drafters do. You don't understand your ecosystem and you accidentally, I do believe it was accidental and intentional, catch a much broader group of stakeholders than you initially intended for your net. And this is just a great example. It's a good lesson for us to watch out for up here too.
Yeah, yeah. So on that note though, what's the worst that could happen if this definition of crypto broker remains unclear? And how could this potentially affect miners in the US, or how could this potentially affect Canada? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen in some ways. I mean, the bill is not yet law, so there's still more work to be done. And I'm sure I can almost put money down on it that there's going to be intense lobbying to clear this up in the language as it moves through. Worst case, nothing happens. Well, we don't know who's going to try and test the legislation. So it could get tested by the IRS. They could try and go after miners, in which case likely going to be a response. There could be lawsuits similarly, and that would test the language as well. But again, there is language on the record in the US, thankfully at the Senate level, indicating their intentions and trying to clarify that this wasn't meant to catch minors. And so that would certainly be brought up and people would look at it. But it does just, for us as a trade partner with the US, I think it definitely makes us create pause for a moment to consider, well, if we leave it out there, how real is the risk? And that's an ongoing assessment. And then would that impact our decision to expand into the US? What does that mean from a business perspective? Is this a possible tax instead of obligations that we would think, it's too much to bother with? We'll rather go somewhere else. Or are we comfortable to say, the risk is low, we're not too worried about it? The point is, though, we have to create pause. And when you run in a fast-paced business ecosystem, that pause for regulatory uncertainty and lack of clarity, especially when it's totally avoidable, it's a frustration point. And so you have to think a little bit further about what you want to do. If the US keeps it all there, though, the other thing that could happen, and this is just, as a former trade negotiator and policymaker myself, I can tell you how this has played out in many different pieces of legislation. When the US sets down legislation, they generally decide once it's finalized that they want their trading partners to adopt a similar approach. And so they could try and force this into Canada, into Canadian legislation, which would create potentially a whole new set of discussions, the same kind of risks for Canadian miners and our ecosystem partners. We don't want that. We're happy where we operate right now. We're really pleased that the government is engaging us. Certainly, the government can do more, which I'm sure we'll talk about momentarily. But, at this time, the government has reached out to us, the Canadian government, and has said, we've watched what's happened in the States. We want your perspective. It deserves acknowledgement. We're really happy about it. But there's work to do, all to say. And the ramifications can be, they can be anything from chilling. So you could see companies just say, you know what, this is too much for us. It's a cost of business we're not willing to undertake, and leave. And then go to other jurisdictions, other parts, possibly Europe, possibly, other areas of the world that are more welcoming and don't have this extra burden. One never knows. But you've got to keep in mind that anything is possible. And the harder you make it to do business because of, regulatory hurdles and unnecessary uncertainty, business just won't stay. It doesn't need to.
Yeah. So there's a federal election going on in Canada right now. And what do you think crypto miners and blockchain companies need the most right now and need to be doing right now in order to prepare for that?
Yeah, number one, we should take the lessons learned from the infrastructure bill and get engaged. Certainly, it's important for companies on the company side to be talking to your local MPs, to be talking to the parties to make sure what you actually need to do business in Canada is clear. If you need more, if you need something different than what's already available, make it clear. This is just generally good advice if you're thinking about regulatory and government affairs in a large company or even a small one. It doesn't matter. For us, we really are asking the government to talk to us. We're asking the government not just to talk to us, actually. We could be totally selfish and say, all we care about is HUD 8. But the reality is, well, if only HUD 8 speaks, only HUD 8's view is provided, we want the whole ecosystem supported. We're an ecosystem partner first and foremost, and an absolute supporter of the broader blockchain and digital asset ecosystem. And as an infrastructure provider, we want our companies and our partners and our friends to do well, and to stay close to us. And we happen to be in Canada. So we are asking that the government establish a formal dialogue, a formal roundtable with the industry partners, including us and other key stakeholders. We want there to be some clarity in regulation and policy. We think it's really important. We don't want to have uncertainty. And it's to our advantage in Canada to do this. I mean, let's just take the lessons learned from the infrastructure bill. If we're thinking about implementing anything remotely close to this, let's just learn from the mistakes now and avoid it, and by having this conversation. So be mindful, but equally we're asking regulators and policymakers to consider, holding back the reflex to throw down a hammer, and to just take stock of what does this mean for the GDP? What are the business opportunities here in Canada? How much could we bring, this kind of innovation forward and benefit Canadians? And I think, that's such an incredibly exciting space to look at when you really turn your mind to what's possible with blockchain and digital infrastructure and digital asset technologies. It's everything from digitizing our identity and our driver's license to, healthcare records to, COVID. One obvious application is, COVID vaccine traceability, or anything you can imagine. If it requires any kind of verifiable credential, it can be leveraging the blockchain innovation ecosystem, and it can equally be leveraging their cross-sector applications. I mean, like in our case, we leverage innovation around power as well. So there's lots to do here, but none of it's going to happen if the government doesn't start to establish commitments and be open and transparent on what it wants to do, and first and foremost engage with the community. So that's our big ask. It's simple in many ways, and yet it's foundational, and we really need it in its time.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We'll definitely have you on again. Again, I know our audiences and our shareholders are really excited to hear from you. So thank you so much, Tanya. And yeah, we'll be in touch with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.